Welcome to Sparking Everyday Discipleship, where we disciple parents to disciple their children with everyday discipleship every day, sparking important conversations with our kids. I'm your host, Terrie Hellard-Brown, and we're so glad you've chosen to spend some time with us today. Today's guest is Jenny Gossell, and she is a fantasy fiction writer. I think it's just so important. This episode, you're going to be really blessed, first of all. And I think we're talking about something that many of us as parents might be a little uncomfortable with unless you're into reading fantasy fiction. Sometimes our kids are reading books we're a little concerned about. And I think that Jenny helps us address some of those issues and talk about some of those things. So you're definitely going to want to listen to this one. Jenny is young. She's just newly married, living in Kansas City with her husband. And I just have enjoyed the conversation with her, and I know it's going to bless you. So let's jump in and join the conversation. Well, Jenny, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to get to talk with you. We met at a homeschool convention, and first of all, the first thing I want you to do is just tell us a little bit about your writing and your books and what's available.
Yes, so I've wanted to be a writer since I was too young to even really write. I was about 6 when I officially decided I'm going to be a published author one day, and I've pretty consistently kept at it since then. I finished my first quote unquote book when I was 12. I wrote a series of 3 books when I was a teenager that I shared with a lot of friends and family members, and a lot of people really enjoyed reading those. That was really encouraging to me. I learned a ton from that. In 2020, I was accepted into what would become the Author Conservatory, which is an online school that trains writers to have author careers. So I was in that 2020 through 2024, and then I just graduated from that last year as part of a capstone project. As I was getting ready to graduate from the conservatory, I published a short story in an anthology. So 8 of my classmates and I worked together. We each wrote one short story, and we published the 9 short stories together in a book called Voices of the Future, Volume 1, Stories of Family and Fearlessness. So I write fantasy, adventure stories, mostly for teens. They can be pretty accessible for slightly younger kids as well, and adults also like them, but I consider teens to be my primary target audience. And I love to write fun, fantastical stories. Usually they have some degree of allegorical elements to varying degrees. So, yeah, that's what I do.
That sounds awesome. Tell us a little bit about the conservatory and what that is, because some of my audience are homeschoolers, and so I would like for them to know more about that.
Right. I think the Author Conservatory is something that a lot of homeschool families will be interested in, certainly have been interested in. It was founded by homeschoolers. Some of our listeners might have heard of Brett Harris and the book Do Hard Things. Brett is one of the founders of the conservatory. The other co-founder is Kara Swanson, who has now published a few young adult fantasy books. They're homeschoolers. A lot of the students are homeschoolers. So this grew out of a program called the Young Writers Workshop, which started in about 2017. I usually describe the Young Writers Workshop to people as like an after-school club for writers, but online. It has video lessons. It has a community site. It's like a forum where the students can interact with each other in a very protected and healthy environment. So a lot of community and some training for young writers who are just getting started. Then kind of out of that grew the Author Conservatory, which is a college level writing alternative program. And that teaches not just writing craft, but also the business side of writing, the marketing side of writing, and just the lifestyle side of writing, how to be an author without burning out, without accidentally ruining all of your in-person relationships, about how to just be a healthy person as you're a writer as well, and to have strong character. So it's very holistic. And the goal is not just to get you published as quickly as possible, but to help you have a very healthy, strong, long-term, God-honoring author career.
Oh, that's amazing. I didn't realize all that it entailed. One of the things I run into, and I know this wasn't on our list of possible topics to talk about, but it just popped in my mind. One of the things I have trouble with new writers is helping them understand the value of critique. and how it can make us better writers. Does the conservatory really help you prepare for that? And how do they do that? How do they toughen you up about, we always call it our baby. Our work is our baby. You got to get to the point where you're willing to say, okay, help me make it what it needs to be. How were you able to do that? How do they help you do that as a young person?
Yes, absolutely. The conservatory very much helps with that, and that's a big piece of what the conservatory does. Thankfully, back when I was 15, 16, 17, writing books on my own, I did start getting some feedback from some friends. So that was very helpful for me. I didn't come into the conservatory cold turkey, like never having gotten critique before. It was helpful to get critique from my friends. It also was pretty painful the first time I found out, like, oh, there's really no reason for the characters to do this except that I wanted them to, and that kind of thing. But it just helped me grow so much. Once I got into the conservatory, it was so much taken to the next level. So, kind of the teaching pattern and method in the conservatory is that you listen to a training, so you get the information, and then you do what the training just taught you to do. You put it into practice, and then you bring what you created to what's called a critique call, which is with an instructor. So the instructor will have usually about 4 to 5 students on a call and will look at their document. They've read it previously, probably made some comments, and they will give critique in a live format, live interaction with the students. So, of course, that can be pretty nerve wracking for the first few times because this isn't even just a friend giving you critique, it's an instructor. And it can be nerve wracking at first, but the instructors are really good at balancing the positive and the negative, and they'll always make sure to leave the students with encouragement and here's what you're doing well, and not just here's what you need to fix. But yeah, I think just putting in the reps and getting over the hump of being nervous about getting feedback, you just so quickly start to see how much better your projects are getting. And you quickly start to recognize, here are my areas of strength, but here are my areas of weakness. But other people are strong in these areas, and they can help me shore up these areas that I'm not as strong in. For me, especially early in my conservatory days, I was having a really easy time with plot, but I was having a really hard time with characters. And so that was just something that I knew. And every time I had a new project, I was like, okay, I'm probably going to completely redo everything I thought I was doing with characters. So I just kind of learned that about myself and came to really appreciate and rely on other people's feedback. It genuinely is so worth it. There's a lot of exchange of feedback between students as well. There definitely is the peer to peer feedback. So that's helpful to be on both the giving and the receiving end and to understand the mindset of the person who's giving critique by also being in that role.
Yeah, I found the same thing with our critiquing in our critique group is I learned so much even from doing the critiques. It helps me grow as a writer as I look at other people's writing and help evaluate that. I think it's so
Yes,
beneficial. Then, of course, it translates into other parts of our lives where we can be more humble and willing to accept criticism or critique on different parts of our lives as well.
for
It's
sure.
helped me a lot in that. So that's great. Okay, well, our podcast, as you know, is a lot about discipleship. And so I wanted to ask you, how can parents disciple their kids who dream of becoming writers one day?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to take it seriously, at least if your child is taking it seriously. If they're really young and in the really early stages, they may just be doing it for fun. They may just be enjoying experimenting with making books like they would experiment with anything else that could turn into a career path. But once they get old enough and serious enough that this is something they really care about, there's a high chance that it's something they really, really care about. And it can be very nerve wracking as a young person to talk to your parents about your writing, especially if you're starting to want to be an author as a career, as more of a long term thing. I know I was really nervous the first time I showed my mom any of my writing. I work with a lot of writing students who are frequently so nervous to share about their writing with their parents. So, as a parent, a lot of times the main thing that your child probably wants when they're telling you about their writing or sharing their writing with you is just to know that you're okay with it, that you're not going to laugh at it. I know that's a very common concern that kids have, that my parents will think this is silly. Kids also can be extra nervous about sharing with their parents if they're writing about like romance or if they're writing anything that's a little bit more on the dark and violent side, it can be very nerve-wracking to share that with your parents, when it could like be very helpful for them to share that with their parents and get some constructive feedback. I would just say, as a parent, be aware that if your child is sharing their writing with you, they're so aware of what's in it and so aware of what your reactions might be. And if they are writing something a little bit on the dark and serious side, or if they're trying to write romance and you think they're a little too young for that, that's just very common for kids who are experimenting with writing. They're just exploring thoughts and feelings and questions that they have. They are thinking about serious things and they're trying to think about them in adult ways. So I think just any encouragement you can give your kids, that you support them being creative, that you like the fact that they want to tell stories, even that can be really encouraging to them. I think other areas of discipleship would just be making sure that they have a healthy imagination, that they have access to really good, really great stories, and also that they have time. One thing that so many young writers and young creatives struggle with is just having so little time. I know that parents always have the best intentions in scheduling a lot of activities for their kids. Sometimes it's kind of unavoidable. Sometimes there are so many things that the kids love that they just can't do them all. But if you've got a young person who is really enthusiastic and serious about writing and about creativity, one of the most valuable gifts you can give them is just the time to think about it, to play with it, because that is an obstacle that a lot of kids face, and maybe again feel nervous about asking their parents, can I stay home from soccer to write? They might not feel like they can do that even if they really want to. All the normal areas of discipleship are so important too, just making sure the kids know the truth so that they can tell stories in accordance with the truth. Make sure that kids love people so that they can write characters in a loving way. It's all just extra important, and important in new ways if they're going to be telling stories.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking too, one of the hardest parts about being a writer is learning to be disciplined. And you were talking about how the conservatory helps you to become a healthy writer. And I think that means we don't just sit and write for so many hours and not get up and move around and not take care of ourselves, but also that we are disciplined. One of the things that I would encourage parents too is to set aside even 15 to 30 minutes a day. If your child's really interested in writing, or if you're just wanting to do creative writing in your homeschool or at home as an elective beyond what the schools offer, because they just don't offer these things anymore, set aside a half an hour a day to read and a half an hour a day to write. And that could be life changing for your whole family, because you're developing that pattern, that discipline. And reading and writing both, I think, are so important for every child to learn. I started creative writing in second grade. That was the first time we wrote a poem. That's what triggered it for me. And I wanted to be a writer from then on. But like you were saying, they need to have a good foundation of what they've read, and then to know the truth. And if we see those red flags in their writing, I think it's hard to discern sometimes whether it's a red flag or just them working through things they've seen on TV, things they've seen their friends talking about, and they're wrestling with those same ideas and how to process that, or if it's something that they're crying out for help. I always come back to the same scripture: if you lack wisdom, ask God, and that He'll give us wisdom and discernment with our kids. Because sometimes I think a child does use their writing to cry out and say, help me, I'm really struggling with this or that.
Right.
Okay, so how can fictional stories disciple kids' souls? Because you write fantasy. So how can that help disciple a kid's soul?
Right. When you're thinking of resources for discipleship, or even just books that can help disciple your kids, probably you wouldn't immediately go to fiction. And within fiction, you probably wouldn't immediately go to fantasy. So I'll say a couple things about fiction in general and then move to fantasy specifically. Fiction in general, well, for one thing, is used quite a bit throughout the Bible as a way to disciple people. The most obvious example that's used a lot is the parables, fictional stories that Jesus decided to use to teach people with. And in some ways, that communicated his meaning more clearly than anything else. Although what's interesting when we hear about the purpose of the parables is that it was also to conceal the meaning. those stories are so full of meaning, and they accomplished a lot that just directly saying, here's the message, wouldn't have done. And all throughout the Old Testament, also, there are symbolic fictional stories or hypothetical situations that end up being stories. So we know just from scripture itself that fictional stories are very powerful and that there's value in telling stories that aren't just here are the facts that really happened in real life. I think a big part of the power of fictional stories is that at the same time, they are a really good training ground for critical thinking and for empathy at the same time. Because a critical thinking exercise could sometimes leave you just feeling like, well, I'm better than these other people who can't think critically, or I understand my position and it's so much better than all the other positions. And it may not teach you all the empathy as much. If you are just learning empathy by itself, then you may start to feel like, well, everybody is kind of right and nobody is really wrong, and now I don't actually know what to think. Stories at the same time, because you're inside a character's head, you're following a character on a journey, they can be an incredible way to learn about loving people and understanding people and seeing this is how someone who's different from me would think about this. But at the same time, in a good story, you see these are the results of this character's actions, or this character said something, but it wasn't actually true. And here's how we know that what they said wasn't true. So why would they say that if it wasn't true? And so it's engaging your mind to figure out what's going on, why are people doing the things that they're doing, and what are the results of those. But at the same time, it's engaging your emotions and your soul and teaching you a lot about people and relationships. So I think that combination is really powerful. And that's something that is true of stories written by Christians, stories not written by Christians. Like, you can learn so much about both critical thinking and empathy from fictional stories that you wouldn't typically get from nonfiction, just because it doesn't have quite as much of the human element. You don't usually get to be inside someone's head to the same extent. Fantasy in particular, which is a genre that sometimes parents have extra concerns about, and there can certainly be reasons for that. But the reason why I think fantasy is such a particularly powerful type of story for discipleship is that it pushes back against materialism, and it pulls back the veil in a sense to say there's more to the world than just what we can see and just what we can experience with our senses. It always bothers me just a little bit when everything except fantasy and science fiction gets described as realistic fiction, because in a sense that would be claiming that reality is just what we see, what we experience on a sensory level, what we can observe in the day to day. Whereas fantasy would say there is more to the universe than that. There is the supernatural, there is a battle going on that we can't see. There are larger than life realities. Fantasy is very good for making us feel small in a big universe and reminding us how much more there is to life than we would recognize if we just thought that we were at the center of everything. I mean, it depends on the fantasy story for whether you'll get that message or not, but the genre is very well suited to it. So I think sometimes parents have a lot of concern about the specifics of a magical element, and that can definitely be something to dig into and to compare against scripture. But I would encourage you not to worry too much about the idea of magic in books in general, because our world is a world that is full of miracles and supernatural realities and a lot more than just the material. And I think it's really important for kids to have stories that help them understand that.
Yeah, I think so too. I know with fantasy, a lot of times you're creating worlds that do not exist. And I think some parents are afraid of that. What would you say to a parent who's concerned about their child creating all these crazy worlds with all these different creatures?
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind is Genesis 1, and how the first time we are introduced to God in the Bible, the very first thing that we find out about God is that He's a creator. The first action that God takes in the entire Bible is creating. And very shortly after that, we find out that God created human beings in His image. And part of that image bearing is that we are also creative. We want to make new things, we want to experiment. Another aspect of that is Adam naming the animals, Adam and Eve keeping the garden. All of that is part of that creative impulse and that desire to imitate God in the sense of being creative like he is. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the fact that a child has the desire to imagine and create their own worlds. Of course, like we were talking about earlier, there could be concerning signs if they just want to invent extremely dark things. But the creative impulse is a gift that we have from God. And continuing to create using the materials that God has given us, telling stories, is part of what it means to be human. Again, similar to what we were talking about earlier, kids may be building imaginary worlds to work through something that they're thinking about or having questions about. Kids also just tend to notice the world and think about the world in really interesting ways, and maybe they build an entire world around that. I remember the imaginary friends that I tried to invent as a kid, and I basically just wanted to pretend that I had a lot of friends to play with, but I did come up with some kind of crazy things for them to do and crazy worlds for them to live in. But I think being creative is very natural, even if it seems a little bit weird. Kids are just experimenting a lot, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. You can tell when a child is really getting drawn into a fantasy world and losing touch with reality. That's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And we do want to kind of keep track of that. One thing I talk about a lot is we've just got to keep the conversations going with our kids. Whatever's going on, they need to be able to talk to us. And if we have a question or a concern, we need to address it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's worse to be like afraid and sitting there worrying about what you read in your child's fantasy story rather than saying, oh, why does this person do this? Or what does this symbolize? Or, let your child elaborate on what they're thinking and what they're going through. I wrote a poem once when I was in middle school, and I was just exhausted, physically, literally exhausted. And I wrote a poem, I Want to Sleep. And my friend read it and thought I wanted to hurt myself.
Oh,
And I didn't know how to tell her. I didn't want to hurt myself. I needed a nap. I was so tired.
yeah.
It wasn't a good poem. It was a literal crying out for sleep. But it was very interesting because as she started talking to me, I realized I was battling depression as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we didn't put a label on it back then. This was 100 years ago. We didn't talk about depression. We didn't talk about medication for depression. But I was really just down. The tiredness was also a sign. I just was overwhelmed with life and needed a break. And so her questioning me, even though it started out like, no, really, I'm just tired, it helped me to realize that I was in a bad place. I was harboring some anger as a teenager, just, teenagers. I was being a real teenager and dealing with a lot of depressing thoughts and negative thoughts. And that poem, with her talking to me about it, really opened my eyes and it helped me a ton. And I was also so amazed that my friend cared that much, that when she read my poem, she was concerned and spoke up. That meant the world to me. And I will always remember that and how much that ministered to my heart to know that someone even cared. Our kids need to know we care. And sometimes maybe they're writing it to see if they can get a rise out of us. Who knows? But we don't have to be afraid to question and explore what's going on in their little minds and what's happening, because maybe they are struggling with something and they want to talk about it, but they don't know how to bring it up. So this would be a way they could open that door. Okay, so how has your writing given you the opportunity, and we're going to flip this a little bit, to disciple your readers?
Yeah. Well, in a couple of different ways. I mean, recently I've been selling my books at live events, which has just been a whole new way for me to interact with readers. I always used to think of my readers as being kind of nebulous people that I would probably never meet. So I've just really loved meeting a lot of readers in person at events and being like, oh, this is the face and the name of the person who's reading my book. So that's been really helpful. And the live events have been an opportunity even to meet readers who are probably not Christians and to be like, well, I mean, join my email list, and I will try to have a ministry through that, and hopefully we can become friends and have a relationship, and hopefully that'll be a blessing to them. I think through my writing itself, the main way that I try to disciple readers, well, obviously there's the theme or the message of the book, which I always want to be something that is going to serve readers well and is going to point them to truth. Usually in my stories, there's a lot about courage, a lot about trust, a lot about stepping out of fear and doing things that are tough but are worth it, and taking the leap and going on the adventure is what a lot of my stories end up being about. There's also, I think, discipleship just through giving people a good time and giving people a fun story, an escape, a rest, just a break from whatever is stressing them out in life. I think that's a way of serving people, even if the theme and the message just go right over their head. If the story is still fun and relaxing and gives them a break after a long day, then I feel like I've at least served them in a sense. And there's all the stuff outside of the fiction writing where I have an email list, and I try to use that to minister to my readers as well, especially since my primary target readers are teens. Since recognizing that, I've shifted my approach and email list a little bit more to not just be like, here are some updates on what I'm writing, although I definitely do send out writing updates. That is what a lot of people want to see. But I'm trying to consider, like, okay, what do these young people need to hear from someone who's just a few years older, in the stage of life where they just graduated college and got married, and so I'm just like a few life steps ahead of my target reader. Like, what do they need to hear from me? How can I encourage them? I've recently started sharing more about like my writing as a teenager and what I learned from that. I really enjoy interacting with readers through my email list as well, and just finding ways to share things with them that seem to be helpful. And I try to listen to my readers as much as possible when they give feedback, when they respond. Like, what did they find helpful? What were they not as interested in? And I'm just always trying to refine how I serve my readers through my email list. And then the fiction writing and the nonfiction writing, or the in person interactions, flow back and forth into each other, because as I'm interacting with readers more at events and over email, I'm like, oh, I think maybe this is the kind of story that this person needs. And so maybe I'm going to write a fiction story a little bit more along those lines. And if I write a story more along those lines, then I'm going to let people know about it over email. And it just all kind of flows together. I'm involved in some teen ministry in real life as well. I grew up in Bible quizzing, and now I've come back as a coach. So I love interacting with teens through that too, and just again getting to know more of what they need and what stories would encourage them and be the most helpful to them in their walk.
I want you to elaborate a little bit on the Bible quizzing, because I don't know much about that group, but it sounds fascinating. And you've done a lot of Bible memory through that. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's not exactly something I can just drop and walk away from, is it? Yeah, Bible quizzing has been really big in my life. I joined it when I was 9. I ended up memorizing the entire New Testament over the course of the next 10 years. So I guess I should explain a bit of how the Bible quizzing ministry that I'm a part of works, which is that it's a team sport where you answer questions that are all word for word from a specific verse. So the type of Bible quizzing I did was not like facts from the Bible or summarize something from an entire chapter. Every question comes from a specific verse and it has to be word perfect. And you work together as a team. So I learned so much of the discipline that you need for writing from Bible quizzing. I learned a lot about teamwork. That's also how I met my husband. So that's great. But yeah, Bible quizzing was huge. And that was also where I started sharing my writing originally. That was how I met the friends who originally critiqued my writing. So I feel like Bible quizzing and writing have always been very intertwined for me. And now I, in a lot of ways, feel like I'm writing for Bible quizzers who love books. Like, if I had to just really niche down to the most specific people that I'm writing for, obviously people who are not Bible quizzers and come from very different backgrounds from that can still enjoy my books. But I really love writing things that I'm like, oh, I think the Bible quizzing teens I know who love reading will really enjoy this.
That's cool. Well, and I think sometimes too, people don't, when they start to write and when they want to be a writer, they don't always think about serving their audience. And you've mentioned that several times. And really, if we're not serving and blessing our writers and affecting them in a good way, a positive way, blessing them in some way, then our writing is just sitting there. It's just there for no reason. So I think that's something, as young writers, if we can encourage them that you really are trying to serve your audience, not cater to them. I mean, we're not writing a story, oh, they need to hear about this, so we're going to write a story about this where we're preaching at people. That's something we've seen happen in some writing lately, but that we are truly serving our audience and blessing them. That's our heart. That's what we want to do. And to, like you said, give them enjoyment, give them a break from the harsh realities that we live in sometimes. I guess unless you're writing dystopian, then you just exaggerate those harsh realities. But anyway, I think that's one thing I wanted to reiterate that you've mentioned several times. I think that's so important for young writers to understand, even old writers to understand that we are here to serve our audience. And I also wanted to mention what a blessing it is. We have so many young, well, young for me, young writers who are Christians beginning to write fantasy, because the fantasy writing out in the world is not always wholesome, and in fact usually is not. So how would you describe, I mean, I think it should be two different genres myself, Christian fantasy and regular fantasy, but how would you describe the Christian fantasy novels, the writers that you've met who write fantasy? How is that different from regular fantasy just out there in the market?
Right. Yeah, there are definitely several different subcategories because I have a lot of friends writing fantasy who are planning to go with Christian publishers and mostly sell to Christians and kind of be in that world. But I also have a lot of friends, and I'm actually in this group myself, who are writing fantasy but hoping to publish with traditional general market publishers and obviously be a part of the Christian book world and be serving a lot of Christians with our writing, but also at the same time cross over onto the general market side.
Mhm.
But either way, there's, I think, definitely a strong distinction in the way that we approach it. What I mostly see in the general market fantasy world right now is that there's kind of either middle grade fantasy, which can often be really good, but it tends to kind of be the same story every time. Right now, among newer fantasies, it's kind of always a kid stumbles into a magical world and has some adventures there, which is a story setup that I really like. But it sort of seems like that's almost all we're seeing for the middle grade readers. Then on the young adult side, everything has gone to very intense and fairly dark romance. And often they are kind of marketed as young adults. So kids as young as like 13, 14 are having books marketed to them that very much center around romance in a way that I often don't think is really helpful for people of any age, especially for teenagers. Some are certainly better than others. But I think one distinction that I'm hoping to bring to the fantasy marketplace, and I think the same with my friends, is a different view of humanity. Where, on the one hand, I tend to find a lot of young adult fantasy romance books to seem very dehumanizing, where the only important thing about the people is their romantic qualities, specifically physically, and that's kind of what the characters get reduced to. So, having a more fleshed out and healthy understanding of humanity and in a positive sense, like, okay, we're a lot more than just this. But then on the other hand, my other kind of main gripe and pet peeve with a lot of young adult fantasy is that I feel like the main characters tend to be placed at the center of everything and the whole story revolves around them, the world revolves around them. And that's not something that they grow out of. A lot of times it's more something that they grow into. So something that I like to bring up in my stories and I think is important is that the characters have to enter into something that is bigger than themselves. That it's
Mhm.
not about them necessarily gaining power or attention. It's a lot more about them joining a bigger cause or sacrificing for their friends. and just recognizing that, like I talked about earlier, the world is a lot more than they thought it was. So, yeah, I think understanding of humanity and humanity's place in the world is maybe one big worldview difference between where I'm writing from and where a lot of my friends are writing from
Mhm.
versus a lot of what you would see in general market fantasy.
Yeah, oh, I think that's huge. It seems like the world is trying to create a generation of narcissists. And I think that is so vital that we read stories that show the world bigger than ourselves and that we can make small differences. We can affect change. We can do something, but it's to bless others. It's to make a difference. It's not so that we are all that. And wow, that's really important. The other thing I see, especially in the middle school level of chapter books and early novels, is everything is geared around witchcraft and the occult. I mean, I can hardly find anything outside the Christian genre that isn't that. Yet, I also think as Christian writers writing fantasy, we often deal with the dark side of life and the battle between good and evil. How would you differentiate that as a parent if you're looking for books for your kids? How can you tell when it's something that's glorifying the occult or something that is showing we're in a sinful world and we need a savior? Is there a way to
Yeah.
tell the difference?
Yeah. A couple of the main things that I would look for would be if there's specifically occult types of magic or witchcraft like magic going on in the story, who is using it? Because if it's the bad guy who's doing that, then it's
Hmm.
probably not being portrayed as a good thing. If we're trying to defeat the person who is doing these dark and evil practices, then that is probably communicating something true, that this is a problem, that it's destructive, and that we don't want to do that. Whereas if you're seeing the main character is doing some dark and concerning things, or the mentor character, the best friend, the love interest, people that we're supposed to root for, if they're the ones who are doing occult type magic, then it's a lot more likely to be something that is being promoted and treated as desirable. The other main thing I would look at to potentially even determine if it is truly occult type of magic or something a little bit less sinister would be, where is the power coming from? I think that's a really important question, because if the power is coming from some spirits who definitely don't seem like very good spirits, or it's coming from the dead, then I would be more concerned about that, because that's kind of how magic in scripture is described if it's that in a cult. Whereas, well, obviously, if the source of the power is a potential Christ figure or like the story's equivalent of God, then you may be seeing something that, like, they're at least trying to have the magic be something that is not sinister. And maybe there are still issues with it, but that is a very different thing if the power is like given as a gift also to the characters versus something that they're taking for themselves. And that makes a big difference. So yeah, I would look for, where is the power coming from, who is using it, and then also what are the results of it. Is it being portrayed as something that will give you satisfaction and the good life and success, or is it something that is really more dangerous than it is worth and has serious consequences?
Okay, yeah, that helps. One other question I have, when I was in creative writing in high school, our teacher reiterated, I don't know how many times, don't write romance. At your age, it's just going to be bad. It just comes across as goofy, hokey, cringy, whatever you want to say. Would you give that same advice to young writers?
I generally would, depending on the age, especially pre teenage years. I would definitely steer clear of it. I did hear that advice when I was just a kid, and I decided to follow it. I was like, you know what? We're not going to try to write romance anytime soon. And I think that was a very good decision. I think it's fair to be a lot of very bad writing that would have happened. I think once you get into the teenage years, there's a place for possibly using fiction to explore some feelings and questions, but that's probably not something you're going to end up publishing. I also think you can make fun of yourself as a kid or teenager if you are comfortable doing that. Like within the story, you can have the character be like, I don't know if this makes any sense, but this is how I feel. And I think it's totally fine also for kids to write about like side characters, like my aunt got married kind of a thing. If kids just really want to write about a wedding, they can write from that kind of outsider perspective. But yeah, I would not try to write a very serious epic romance before you've had that life experience. I think as a general rule, I would try to keep it for like your main character's experience or something that's very central to the story. I would try to keep it to what you've experienced yourself. It's kind of the rule of thumb.
Oh, that's true. That's what they tell a lot of writers. Write what you know, not
Yeah.
what you wish you knew. All right, that's great. Well, before we end today, I wanted you to share how people can reach you, how they can find your writing. And we're talking about having a special offer for our readers. So, would you share about all of that?
Yes. So you can find everything at jennygossell.com. That's just my name.com. You can find my book there with my short story in it, which is called People of the Rain. You can sign up for my email newsletter there. I'm also going to set up a special page just for listeners to this podcast episode. That's going to be jennygossell.com/discipleship. There, I'm going to have a free PDF for you of 12 ideas for discipling your kids through fiction. So it's going to be a PDF of conversation starters, discussion ideas for how to walk your kids through the fiction books they're reading and dig with them into the stories that they're interacting with. So I will set up a page for you guys where you can find that PDF if you're interested in more ideas for discussing books with your kids with the goal of discipleship. That will be at jennygossell.com/discipleship.
Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate that. I hope my readers will take advantage of that. I know I'm going to check it out. I appreciate you being here today. I love what you shared with us. I think this is important for parents who especially have teenagers who are interested in being writers or who are into fantasy fiction. I think you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you for spending time with us today. If we sparked any questions or you want to share a comment, we would love to hear from you. Be sure to check out Jenny's website and especially jennygossell.com/discipleship, where she has some great resources for you. And in the show notes, she's also given us some ideas of some good, wholesome Christian worldview type fantasy novels that you can feel a little safer with your kids reading rather than going out there. And some of the novels, as we know, are really geared toward the occult, and we don't really want our children reading a lot of that. So we have a list that we can share with you that you can feel more comfortable getting these books for your kids. If you have any questions or comments, please post those in the show notes at terriehellard-brown.com. And you can ask any question. We always answer your questions, and we also appreciate your comments. If you have questions for Jenny, you can go to her website, jennygossell.com, and check out her material there, join her mailing list, find out more about her writing and what all is going on there. We just appreciate you, and we hope that we are blessing you as we talked about in the podcast. We want to serve our audience well. We feel that God has called us to be writers, and we want to serve you. We want to bless you, and we want to bless your children. So let us know if you have some ideas or questions or comments. We want to hear from you. As always, most of all, we pray that you feel empowered and equipped and encouraged to walk by faith and to embrace everyday discipleship every day with the people in your life.